Everyone hates passwords and the absurd security rules that come with them, cynically summarized as pick something you can't remember and don't write it down. These rules are impossible to follow, but if your account gets broken into, they'll be blaming you for having violated the password policy. That's really unfair. But besides being pathetic from a usability perspective, passwords are also terrible from a security perspective. They can be guessed, they can be brute forced, they can be shoulder surfed, they can be keylogged, they can be eavesdropped, they can be phished, they can be leaked at the verifier, and we have a whole vocabulary for the ways that passwords can be compromised. Every now and then, a major company gets hacked into, hundreds of millions of user accounts get compromised, and all these people who had no fault in the matter have to change their password, even if they were diligently using a super complicated, unguessable one. Bill Gates said the following in 2004. There is no doubt that over time, people are going to rely less and less on passwords. People use the same password on different systems, they write them down, and they just don't meet the challenge for anything you really want to secure. And yet, here we are, almost 20 years later, and we still have to juggle more passwords than ever. Why is that? Let's find out. Welcome to Frank Stajano Explains. I'm Professor of Security and Privacy at the University of Cambridge, and this is a lecture in my cybersecurity course for second-year undergraduates. Today's topic is passwords. How they work, how they fail, why we are still using them, and what else we could be doing instead. I have worked on passwords, or rather on getting rid of passwords, for many years, leading a team of wonderful researchers and even founding a startup. So I could speak for days and days on this topic, and I'll still leave something out that I thought was important. But anyway, I'll do my best not to go over time today. Let's get started. Traditionally, confidentiality, integrity, and availability are considered three of the most important properties in security. Given a set of objects in our system and a set of subjects, known or unknown, who might wish to access these objects, then confidentiality, the stuff of secret codes, ciphers, and access control, is about ensuring that objects may only be read by authorized subjects. Integrity is about ensuring that only authorized subjects may modify the objects. And availability is about ensuring that whenever authorized subjects wish to access objects, they are able to do so within a reasonable service time. All three of these definitions rely on being able to distinguish authorized subjects from unauthorized ones, which in turn relies on being able to recognize the authorized subjects from those who might attempt to impersonate them, which we might take as a definition for authentication. We thus see that authentication is an implicit prerequisite for all three of the foundational security properties. The subjects to be authenticated might be humans, roles, organizations, even machines, and so might the entity performing the verification. The authentication might be unidirectional from prover to a verifier, or bidirectional where each of the two entities proves its identity to the other. There might be a malicious adversary in the middle, observing all communications and later replaying them selectively, perhaps with subtle tweaks in order to impersonate a subject to another. Protocols, authentication protocols, have been devised to perform authentication in almost all possible combinations of scenarios. Flaws have been discovered in many of these protocols and then patched. Formal verification tools have been created to prove or disprove the correctness of proposed authentication protocols. Protocols that were proved correct have been successfully attacked by violating the modeling assumptions of the formal tools used to perform the verification. Authentication is a vast subfield of security, and no matter how much we say, we will not be able to do justice to many of its facets, and this would still be true even if we devoted the entire lecture course just to this topic. Traditional wisdom on authenticating people is that the verifier should check something you know, or something you have, or something you are. The feature to be checked should be unique to you and hard to replicate by would-be impersonators. In this lecture, we will shine a spotlight on passwords, as I said, which is the prototypical something you know. Passwords are still dominant today as a technology for user authentication to a remote machine, despite being really obsolete and flawed for that purpose. We'll examine how passwords work, how they fail, what has been attempted to replace them, and why the alternatives have not been able to take over yet. How do passwords work? The typical user interaction pattern for logging into a remote website consists of two questions. Username, who do you claim to be, and password. Now, prove it. So whether they are defensible or not, the underlying assumptions include the following. Number 1, nobody other than you knows your password. Number 2, nobody is able to guess your password. And number 3, the website, the verifier, is able to verify whether the password you supply is the correct one. So both the first and the second assumptions are unlikely when the password is chosen by the user. Conversely, when the password is a random string assigned by a computer, it is unlikely to be remembered and it gets usually written down. This in turn may lead to violations of the first assumption, that nobody other than you knows your password. Now, in the old days, to make the third assumption hold, namely that the verifier is able to verify, then the website remembered the plaintext password as well to compare. Now, besides constituting a violation of the first assumption that nobody else knew the password, of course, in this case, the verifier also knows the password, this practice allows an attacker to learn the password to all user accounts as soon as she cracks into the website. In the early 1970s, Roger Needham at Cambridge, later to be the head of the department and then also the PhD advisor of my PhD advisor, invented a better way of doing it. The password is fed through a cryptographic hash function yielding a scrambled up digest, which is easy to compute given the input, but from which it is computationally impossible to recover the input. So easy to compute, but infeasibly hard to invert. Then only the digest is stored on the server next to the username. On authentication, the prover supplies the password, the verifier hashes it without storing it, and checks the hash against the stored digest. So the attacker who cracks into the server may steal the hashes, but may not easily recover the original passwords from them. This clever invention spread widely and became almost universally adopted by subsequent multi-user operating systems, although not, as we remarked, by the many websites that reinvented the login wheel with no awareness of prior art. Now, although the attacker who captures the list of digests will not be able to read the password in reverse from the digest, she may attempt to brute force the password and use the leaked digest to verify her attempt. The most naive attacker would try all possible passwords, leading to those unrealistically optimistic claims for the defender that an 8-character password, including upper and lowercase characters and digits, will require approximately 200 trillion attempts. But this kind of attacker only exists in the imagination of the people who circulate these misguided statistics. The mathematics is correct, but does not match reality. Any attacker with enough brain cells will start by trying the passwords that people actually use, things like 123456, or QWERTY, or password. You should just search the web for most common passwords and you would download a list of these things. Then they would try person names, pet names, words from the dictionary, spelling variations on all the above, and so forth. And the total number of these plausible candidate passwords is tiny, perhaps 8 or 10 orders of magnitude smaller than those alleged 200 trillions. And yet, this much smaller subset usually still cracks some non-negligible proportion of the available accounts. An important mindset shift is that, spear phishing operations aside, the attacker is actually not interested in cracking a particular account, but merely in cracking some account, that is to say, the ones with the easiest to guess passwords. These can be raided for whatever assets they contain, and then maybe they can also be exploited for privilege escalation as a first foothold in the machine under attack. Therefore, when the attacker hashes 123456 and looks for the presence of the result in the capture's digests, if she finds a match, she is happy to have cracked an account. She doesn't care whose password it was. Note also that if 2 distinct users choose the same weak password, they will have the same digest. And therefore, non-unique digests are a strong hint to the attacker that their common pre-image must be an easily guessed password, because 2 people independently came up with it. And the insider threat is perhaps even worse here. If Alice, a user on the system, notices that Bob has the same digest as her, she knows they both have the same weak password, and she can now log into Bob's account. This is one of the reasons why in Unix the digests were moved from etc password, where they were originally stored in the second field, to a new file called etc shadow. The etc password file had to be world readable because users needed to access the other fields, but the new etc shadow could be made unreadable to others. The smart attacker of a system where passwords are hashed observes that she doesn't have to wait until she's penetrated the server to start cracking passwords. She may as well hash candidate passwords in her spare time anyway, and save the results in a large lookup table, investing months and years in this effort if need be, and then as soon as she finally captures or maybe buys or trades or anyhow acquires a file of digests, she can crack it on site by looking it up on her table. This is pretty bad news for the rest of us. To defeat this attack optimization of being able to look up the inverses of digests, in the late 1970s, Unix security architects Bob Morris and Ken Thompson introduced the practice of salting the passwords before hashing them. For each password, a random string is generated, the salt, and it is the concatenation of the password and the salt that gets hashed to form the digest, each password with a different salt. The password file then stores next to the username the digest and also the salt that was used to obtain that digest. So to verify a password supplied by a prover, the verifier looks up the salt in the password file, concatenates it with the supplied password, hashes the lot, and checks whether it matches the stored digest. Now, the attacker who manages to exfiltrate the password file is still able to do the same, of course, so the presence of the salt does not strengthen the system in the face of users who pick weak passwords, because the attacker can still do the same check. But at least he stops the attackers from cracking those weak passwords on site with just a lookup into a pre-computed table, because a salt of k bits increases the computation and storage requirements for the attacker by a factor of 2 to the k. And that's a very good trade-off for the defenders, because an inexpensive defense of just storing an extra k bit per user greatly increases the attack cost by a factor of 2 to the k, exponential increase for the attacker. Now, as further protection against mass cracking of passwords, the technique of key stretching consists of taking the password and the salt and then hashing them not once but many times, say 1,000 times, so that the digest generating function becomes hash to the 1,000 rather than just hash. And hence it is 1,000 times slower, or however many you choose. Although the computation is still almost instantaneous when verifying a user's password in the course of legitimate operations, it will now take 1,000 times longer for attackers to attempt to crack the easy passwords in an exfiltrated etc. shadow file on their dedicated bank of GPUs, as those people tend to do. Watch this other video on how the bad guys crack hashed passwords.
Today, we sent a camera out on a Hollywood Boulevard to help people by asking them to tell us their password. And this is how that went.
We're talking about cybersecurity today and how safe people's passwords are. What is one of your online passwords currently?
It is my dog's name and the year I graduated from high school.
Oh, what kind of dog do you have?
I have a Chihuahua Papillon.
And what's its name?
Jameson.
Jameson. And where'd you go to school?
I went to school back in Greensburg, Pennsylvania.
What school?
Hempfield Area Senior High School.
Oh, when did you graduate?
In 2009.
Oh, great.
It's like my cat's name and then just like a random number.
Okay.
But,
Have you had this cat for a while?
yeah, she's my childhood pet.
Aw. And what's her name?
Her name is Jolie.
Jolie.
Mm-hmm.
So like a password of yours would be Jolie and then a number.
Yeah.
Like number 1?
Like my birthday.
Oh, when is your birthday?
June 12th.
Oh, nice. And what year were you born?
95.
Oh, great.
Mhm.
So Jolie, 6, 12, 95.
Yes.
Got it.
So you mean to give my password right now? No, I cannot do that.
But we all want to know what it is so we can tell you if it's strong or not.
Oh my goodness. Let me think. Okay, one is Tel Aviv. Yeah. 4, 6, 8. And then Israel. It's only 3, but it's, for me it's strong enough.
If you're serious about protecting a system, you must always consider that the system encompasses not just the machines, but also the users of these machines. And the main problem with passwords is appropriately summarized in this wonderfully cynical quote that Mikko Hipponen claimed to have overheard in 2011. Pick something you can't remember, then don't write it down. Sometimes back in the 1960s or 1970s, when most regular people had never seen a computer, and the others who had at most a single account, it might have been reasonable perhaps to ask those rare computer users to remember one very important login password. But nowadays, when people have to juggle hundreds of accounts, it's unreasonable to demand that they remember a different unguessable password for each of them. And yet, if they don't, they get blamed for making the system insecure. This adds insult to injury and is fundamentally unfair. Security professionals have an ethical duty to do better than that. Each of the demands from narrow-minded security administrators has arguably some justification. Passwords should not consist of names, dates, or familiar information, otherwise they could be guessed. That's true. Passwords should include mixed case, symbols, and digits, otherwise the whole password space could be brute force. It's also true. Passwords should not be written down, otherwise they could be discovered by attackers. It's also true. But the aggregation of these demands makes them ridiculously inappropriate, even if they might be individually defensible, because the intersection of all these constraints is the empty set. The techies who come up with such security policies seem incapable of seeing the big picture. They should not be allowed to get away with just dumping the problem on the users. They must offer a solution. We must offer a solution that achieves an acceptable level of security, but without imposing an unreasonable burden on the users. Clearly, users will not be able to comply with a set of mutually incompatible rules. That's just a fact. Some rules will have to be violated. One of the most common coping mechanisms is for users to reuse one password on several sites. The problem with this practice is that when one site is broken into and its password file is exfiltrated and cracked, the other sites where the user reused the same password are now also at risk. Some sites will have lower security than others. In fact, some of these sites might even be run by criminals on purpose, for the purpose of collecting your password and then trying it out on various banking or e-commerce websites and see if you have used the same one. And therefore, the security of the set of accounts protected by the same password is bounded upwards by the security of the least secure of the websites in the set. So this leads to the recommendation that you should be using a different password for every site. And that in itself is a good idea. But this in turn is incompatible with the request that all passwords be remembered by heart. So something has to give. The least defensible of these directives that strict system administrators give their users is this last one, to memorize all the passwords, which clearly cannot scale to dozens or hundreds of accounts. Another indefensible directive is that you should be choosing something memorable that attackers should not be able to guess. Now, in the age of social media and of GPUs with billions of transistors, this is essentially a contradiction in terms, because most passwords that a non-security nerd can remember can also be guessed, especially if the attacker can seed the search with personal data about the victim that they can find on social media. Now, three security researchers, Florencio, Hurley, and Koskun, in a 2007 paper titled "Do Strong Word Passwords Accomplish Anything?", have insightfully argued that those system administrators who impose draconian restrictions on the passwords that the users might choose would instead do better to secure the server that holds their password file. And the reason for that is because the threat of brute forcing the easy passwords is only realistic in an offline attack, where the attackers have the password file with the digests and they can try as many millions of times per second as their bank of GPUs allows them to do. Whereas in an online attack, where they have to try by sending a request to the website, then a mass cracking operation would quickly generate an abnormal number of failed logins that ought to alert the site administrators that an attack is taking place. So this greatly limits the rate at which attackers may try password guesses in an online attack. And therefore, if these system administrators actually do their job, harden their system, and don't let the bad guys exfiltrate the password digest file, then they're forcing the attackers onto online attacks only. And at this point, it's no longer necessary to require users to adopt the kind of super high entropy passwords that would be needed to resist an offline attack. As I said at the start of the video, Bill Gates said in 2004 that passwords had basically outlived their usefulness. So why is it that now, almost 20 years later, we still have more passwords than ever? Innumerable alternatives to passwords have been proposed, and I'm quite familiar with this problem because I worked on it for years. I proposed my own solution, a handheld password manager called Pico, and I even started a company around it. After publishing my vision about Pico and before starting an implementation project around it, I also led the team that wrote one of the most highly cited papers in this field, which established a framework for comparing password replacement schemes on the three axes of security, usability, and deployability, which is a word we invented to describe the ease and convenience with which a technology could be deployed. We thoroughly analyzed 35 alternative schemes along 25 criteria, and we noted that although many alternative schemes were stronger than passwords on the security front, and some were better on the usability front, no scheme was superior to passwords on the deployability front. And the friction necessary to overcome the transition costs was the main reason why we expected passwords not to go away anytime soon. The experience with my Pico startup, Cambridge Authentication, which failed early, taught me valuable practical lessons on security usability. Even though every user we met professed to hate passwords and to love us for developing a more usable and more secure replacement, they all had evolved their own coping strategies to which they were dearly attached. They were not willing to endure the friction of moving to a new system, even if theoretically easier to use and more secure, unless it solved the password problem in all possible circumstances. A prototype like ours that only worked for an initial subset of cases was not appealing because they'd have to use both the new and the old system in parallel. This gave an almost unbeatable advantage to the incumbent technology of passwords, particularly as the more radical alternatives required changes both at the user end and at the server end. Site operators would not consider supporting a new technology unless most users had adopted it already, and conversely, users would not bother adopting a new technology unless they could use it with most sites and platforms. This validated our prediction in the Quest paper that deployability would be a crucial factor for the success of any new password replacement scheme. One reason why passwords have always been the default go-to method for user authentication, despite their undeniable usability shortcomings, is what economists call a moral hazard, which Wikipedia describes as a situation where an economic actor has an incentive to increase its exposure to risk because it does not bear the full costs of that risk. It's the website, not the users, who decides how to authenticate users. But the website does not bear any of the costs of choosing passwords over choosing any other method, the cost here being the usability pain of passwords. On the other hand, for the website, passwords are the easiest technology to deploy. Everybody understands how to use it, they don't have to train their users, it's supported by all client platforms, and crucially, the marginal cost per additional user is essentially zero, which is not the case for any of the other schemes that involve, for example, physical tokens. Say Facebook. Facebook reached 1 million users before its first injection of external capital. How could it have coped if the cost per user of their chosen authentication solution had not been negligible? If we want to talk about possible alternatives, going back to something you know, something you have, and something you are, one might wonder how hardware security tokens and biometrics would fare against passwords, which we dealt with in the Quest paper. Authentication tokens have the potential of offering rather better security than passwords. They might have secure storage for user credentials and key material, and they might have processing power for running cryptographic operations and authentication protocols that a password user could not do in their head. But tokens generally fare poorly on usability, especially when they don't talk directly to the backend over some wireless network, but instead require user interaction to transcribe authentication codes between a tiny LCD on the token and the user's computer. But besides that, the main user complaint about hardware tokens is that they need to be carried around. To a first approximation, only the smartphone has provided sufficiently high utility to the users to have earned the privilege of being carried everywhere, voluntarily, on a par with house keys and wristwatch. So the dedicated security tokens do not reach that bar, particularly when it's one token per account, instead of a single universal token for all accounts. In many cases, tokens are deployed when the system administrator requires greater security and imposes the tokens on the user base without leaving them the choice and ignoring usability complaints. When the poor users say, I forgot the damn token at home and now I can't log in. Smartwatches, which are instead bought and worn voluntarily by users as fashion or technology items, have a better chance of serving as security tokens, particularly when the same company is in the privileged position of designing and manufacturing all three of the smartwatch, the computer it talks to, and the operating system that accepts the smartwatch as authentication token instead of password. Smartphones, for that matter, are themselves becoming security tokens precisely because users carry them around voluntarily. Of course, physical tokens may be lost, which denies service to the owner, or could be stolen, which, besides the denial of service, may also result in impersonation by the thief, unless the token itself must be unlocked before use, which in turn affects its usability. Biometrics. Biometrics, if properly implemented, have the potential of offering high usability insofar as the user does not have to either remember or carry anything. Regarding security, several considerations are in order. Firstly, replay attacks. Biometrics are not secrets. They are observable features of the individual. Authentication through biometrics is about recognizing those features as yours, but this must be coupled with a liveness check to assess that the features were sampled from a person as opposed to having been replayed to the sensor, such as a gummy finger impression for fingerprints, a photograph for the iris scan or face recognition, a recording for voice print recognition, and so on. When the liveness check is carried out with some kind of challenge response protocol, such as, say the following random word so I know that it wasn't a recording, then we are no longer in the realm of do-nothing technology, and so the usability suffers. But more importantly, the requirement for liveness check makes biometrics utterly unsuitable for remote unsupervised authentication, which is the standard situation of logging to a website across the network. So biometrics are okay when you are at the border control and next to you there's a guard with a machine gun and it's obvious whether you're putting your own finger or a gummy impression. Now, when instead it's the bank at the other end of the cloud, then they have no guarantees that the finger that went on the fingerprint reader and matched the fingerprints on file is the one of the account holder, as opposed to being a gummy replica or, in a more gruesome version, a finger that has been chopped off from the owner. Now, secondly, biometrics cannot be revoked or changed. If some backend is compromised, then your fingerprints or irises or whatever it is will leak. And the fact that you have only one set of irises, one set of fingerprints and so on is also a privacy concern, because your interactions with the various verifiers, banks and shops and medical institutions and anything you might wish to be somewhat discreet about can be linked to each other if these backends talk to each other in a way that would not be possible if you used different credentials with each of the verifiers. So perhaps a good niche for biometric authentication is unlocking a local device that you own, such as your smartphone or your computer, where relinking between various verifiers is no longer a concern. You will still have to worry about replay or impersonation attacks if your device is stolen, but the convenience of not having to type a PIN or a password several times a day may outweigh that concern if theft is considered an infrequent and unlikely occurrence. A different alternative, a systemic approach to address the proliferation of passwords, is the so-called single sign-on, which is an arrangement whereby you authenticate once to some kind of authentication service provider, and thereafter the individual sites talk to that ASP directly and let you in without any further interactive challenges. An insightful paper by Pashalidis and Mitchell classifies single sign-on systems along two axes. Whether the ASP resides on the user's machine, the case they designate as local, or on some remote server, which they call proxy-based, and whether the ASP runs a proper authentication protocol with the verifiers, which they call the true single sign-on, or simulates the sending of passwords for backwards compatibility, which they call the pseudo single sign-on. So this yields 4 quadrants. The various options have complementary trade-offs, and this taxonomy is a good way to think about them. In practice, the problem with single sign-on systems is that single is usually wishful thinking. One single sign-on, for example Raven at the University of Cambridge, will log you into a variety of systems, yes, but you will still have to log into many others not covered by the single sign-on, where you'll have to authenticate in other ways, probably by retyping some password. So we observe that the password manager in the browser, one of the most sensible approaches to cope with the unending proliferation of passwords, and one of the most highly rated schemes in our Quest paper with the comparative analysis of password replacements, fits into this taxonomy as a local pseudo single sign-on system. We'll have quite a bit more to say about security usability in our forthcoming lecture on human factors, but observe the different attitudes of the policy setters when they have a captive audience versus when their users may choose to go elsewhere. Florencio and Hurley perceptively observed that it is primarily in the second case that we witness greater attention for usability than for security, in recognition of the fact that annoyed users might vote with their feet and take their custom elsewhere. And so we see that the password security policies that corporations impose on their own employees, you have to have uppercase, lowercase, at least one symbol and a number and all that stuff, tend to be more draconian and more annoying and more disruptive than those that are offered by the same corporations to their potential customers, who are not obliged to follow that, and they could go somewhere else if it's too annoying. And extending from that observation, we know that websites that want their visitors to stay logged in realize that visitors would just rather avoid the site than having to type a password at every visit. And so these websites drop a long-lived cookie in the visitor's browser at the first login that keeps the visitor logged in for months without annoying them further. And this assumes that the endpoint, which is the visitor's laptop or phone, is trustworthy. And this is a reasonable trade-off compared to forcing a new login at every visit, which would most likely deter the visitor from returning. And indeed, some of the greatest improvements to security usability, in particular with respect to ameliorating the situation with respect to passwords, are likely to come from companies that have a profit-based reason for alleviating the pain that customers experience. The e-commerce companies prefer to dial down the security and absorb the losses if this makes customers more comfortable with visiting the site and spending more time shopping. Even banks are now moving on from the allegedly super secure dedicated login tokens to just smartphone apps that do the same thing, but on a device that the user will not have to hunt around for and is willing to carry around voluntarily. In a 2015 article that we wrote with the same winning team that had done the Quest paper, we documented that when companies choose to allow their users to log into their websites with weak passwords, and they also give them a long-lived login cookie so that they only have to type the weak password once a month, they actually compensate by doing more security work in the back end. The password is now treated as only one of several hints, other hints being the long-lived login cookie we mentioned, the IP address from which the user is logging in, the identity of the browser, the machine, the geolocation inferred from the IP address, the time of day, and so forth. Each of these indicators is assessed and compared against its history, and flags are raised when too many of the indicators signal some anomaly. At that point, the user is challenged to provide further evidence of the genuineness of the login. The user may be asked to respond to a challenge sent through another channel such as email or telephone or SMS. And these extra checks, which are typically triggered by a trip abroad or a change of laptop, this may have happened to you, may be disruptive, but they are only invoked when anomalies are detected. And instead, when a login does not look suspicious because it follows the usual pattern, then the user is allowed in with minimum fuss and does not have to bother with a super complicated password. Now, I talked a lot today, but for once there is no seed lab associated with this topic, so you're off the hook this time regarding homework. In our next video, we'll be talking about cross-site request forgery. So if you find you have some spare time today, you might want to get ahead and do the seed lab for that. Otherwise, catch up with past seed labs. Thank you very much for watching till the end, and you may signal that you did that by writing a comment including the word motherboard. Happy hacking, and see you in the next video.